an all-knowing Amsterdammer, which says enough. Also because of his lifelong interest in the strip. Since he was a child, he never lost that interest. It's only continued to develop and developed into part of his profession. He's also worked as a distributor of comic strips in the Netherlands and as a translator. Also at the table is Louis Tas, Amsterdam psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. His interest is also twofold: as a reader interested in the books of Art Spiegelman, but also because of his own background as a survivor of the Nazi camps and the father of children, one of the great themes of Art Spiegelman's work. And the fourth person on the podium is well known to all of you, Joost Zwarte, the distinguished Dutch cartoonist, who is also here for a double reason, not only because he's a colleague of Art Spiegelman, but also because he is the organizer of the Haarlemse Stripdagen, which are one of the instances which have brought art over on this trip to the Netherlands. The others, who I would like to thank very warmly are the publishers Ogenblik and Penguin Books. Finally, the Jewish Historical Museum, which has organized the very impressive exhibition now still on view, were one of the organizations which helped to make this afternoon possible. And now I give the microphone to Johannes van Dam.
Well. Well, first of all, I'll try to stay here because, I don't walk so well. My function will be that of the straight man, the aangever. I'll just try to get these other gentlemen to speak, and when there's a silence, I'll try to start them over again. Won't be necessary because Art can talk very well, and maybe I'll have to stop him instead of stimulate him. I'm not going to tell a lot about art. First, I'll tell you how this afternoon is structured. I'll introduce art, which is hardly necessary, so it's okay. And there will be a conversation, but it will be a structured conversation. If there's any very specific question on a very specific subject, then you may call from the room and ask, but we'll give you an opportunity to pose questions on paper during the intermission. You'll get a piece of paper at the entrance where the bookshop is, and put your question to paper, and we'll try to answer it in the second half after the intermission. During the intermission, we will try to get Art to sign books that will be sold at the same place, which may be an organizational bottleneck, but we'll manage. And just one book because he always makes a drawing in it, and it will take too much time, and we'll have only a very small intermission. Art Spiegelman, he's like me, second generation Jewish, not born in Germany. My mother fled from Germany long before. His parents went through a whole shindig that we are sitting here for now. He was born in Sweden, I think, and lived in the United States and developed himself as a cartoon artist. He draws cartoons, but he was not very well known. He was known, Joost knew him, I knew him, and a few other people in Holland. And he was an artist. Artists knew him very well because he edited magazines, founded magazines. He did not have a very specific style that you could say immediately, this is the typical Art Spiegelman style. He used style as something that followed the function, followed the contents of the comics he made. And that's not something you have to do when you want to become a well-known artist, and you have to stick to just one thing that's very clear and everybody knows. Art didn't do that. So, when he started on Maus, and how he started, that is maybe a story that's already told in the books and in all the interviews. Nobody wanted to publish him. He was a non-entity. He was a publisher of magazines, okay, but, well, who read the magazine Raw? It wasn't published by Penguin then, not yet. And the first Raw, well, this is Raw number 2 I have here. And I think that's the first publication of Maus in the way it was to be published in book form. This little thing in the back, hardly noticed by anyone. He tried to sell it as a project that could be published as a book. Jewish organizations, the Holocaust as a comic. No. It took a very long time and very courageous publishers, and above all, very courageous Art Spiegelman, to finally get...
Can I correct that?
Oh yes, please.
Yes. I didn't try to find a publisher. I assumed that there would be no publisher.
You would try to find funding for it.
I tried to get grants as a cartoonist in a time when now it's possible for a cartoonist in America on occasion to get grants, but at that time it really wasn't, because I remember applying to one and it was, I was told, well, there are words, we give grants for words. Yeah, there are pictures. Well, we give grants for pictures, you must be mixed media. So I was up for grants against Nam June Paik and I never won. And I assumed that Maus would be self-published like Raw, and I didn't think it would be so much that there would be a problem with Jewish organizations. I just thought that there was a problem in that only a rather rarefied audience was interested in comics, let's say. So it was only much later in the life of Raw magazine where an agent contacted me saying that there was a Greek publisher who wanted to buy the rights to Raw because he thought it was sex comics because of the title. And I explained that I didn't think it was what they had in mind, but I sent it along anyway. And the foreign rights man at this agency, who was not an agent, but he was just the foreign rights guy, eventually moved to Israel since, but at the time was very excited by Maus and asked if he could represent it. I didn't know he wasn't an agent. As a result, he brought it around to every publisher in New York, but didn't know any of them. He was just trying to be an agent. And as a result, he got it, not maybe as a result only of his ineptitude, but also of the strangeness of the book. It was rejected everywhere, including from the very courageous publisher you were mentioning, who eventually published it because a person who was a friend of mine, who was the art director there, convinced them to publish it.
Yeah, that's how things go.
Just to keep the record straight.
Very good.
How did you start your comics? When you were very young, you came with your parents to the United States from Sweden, where you were born. Mm-hmm. And what was the first comics that you read?
But probably the very first was Donald Duck, I assume. Yeah. But the first comics that I really... Well, and then I saw Batman before I could read.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me because I couldn't read the words. In fact, it's part of how I learned how to read, was I wanted to understand why this guy who looked like a villain was having all these issues.
Yeah.
You know, I thought that only heroes would get all these books. Yeah. And then somewhere in there I discovered Mad Comics. Yeah. Very early. And it seemed like I'd found something forbidden. I knew my parents shouldn't see it, even when I was 7 years old. It seemed like a kind of pornography, you know.
But before that, the Donald Duck they bought for you, or was it
Donald Duck was available, it was somehow, I don't know how it fell into my life. They must have bought it, because I didn't have much of an income at 6. The Mad comics, I think, were the things that made the strongest impression, about the age of 6 or 7, maybe at the latest. And I think it's at that point that I decided I wouldn't be a fireman anymore.
And the comics artist?
Make comics was more interesting.
So that's quite early. At what age was it?
About 6 or 7.
6 or 7.
That it became really, somebody makes this, I want to be one of those people. Yeah.
And had you any idea how to become a comic artist? Just start drawing, or did you?
I thought it was easy. You just have to copy exactly what you see.
Yeah.
So I learned to draw Donald Duck and Dennis the Menace and Little Lulu and the characters in the Mad stories.
And at a later age, you thought to do something about the skill of making comics, to go to an art school?
Later, of course, you know, when you said something about how I got these comics, the comics that made a very deep impression on me, aside from the Mad comics, were the horror comics that actually preceded my moment of comic book reading. They were really around from about 1952 to 1955. It was a big fad, like Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and I was really of comics reading age at about 56 to 60. But I found a large pile of Tales from the Crypt on the garbage can. And these were the kind of comics that were forbidden then, because there was as part of the kind of McCarthy hysteria of the 50s, these were seen as a kind of Jewish communist agitprop of some kind.
It was part of the comic code.
And so there's a comic code that purified the comics. So by the time I was really able to go out and buy comics with my allowance money, the comics were sanitized. And these weren't. These were about horror entering into the daily life, kind of. Like one cover is a subway car with people hanging onto the strap and one arm hanging onto the strap without a person. Was a typical cover. And for me, these made a profound impact. And I realized much later that it in a way connects to Maus, like that it's kind of horror entering into daily life. And it's about the dead coming back for revenge. And it was made by these kind of secularized Jews after the war. Without it being conscious, I think it was a response to Auschwitz, these Tales from the Crypt comics. So I found these things. And then I was buying a lot of comics, even the sanitized ones. But my father was unhappy because I would spend 10 cents for each comic. But near where he worked, at the Diamond Dealers Club, you could get 3 comics for 10 cents, but older ones.
Different.
Yes, you'd get the older ones. So he would bring home unwittingly, because he wasn't very acculturated. And he didn't know that these things caused juvenile delinquency, these bad comics like the Tales from the Crypt. But he knew that they were 3 cents a piece. So he would tell me not to buy comics, and he would bring me comics, the really good ones, where I would get the things that really informed me as a cartoonist, which were from the earlier eras.
And then, of course, we have Harvey Kurtzman, a very important cartoonist who started the magazines like Help and Humbug and Mad Magazine, of course. And he brought in a new way of telling stories to say that, to express, for instance, the combat heroes. Wasn't it called like that? The
Frontline combat.
Frontline combat, that's right, So there were stories about war without heroes. It's not the American soldier as being a sort of a superhero, but more you see the suffering of a soldier in the trenches.
Yeah, like this guy Harvey Kurtzman did these first Mad comics that influenced me, including like Mickey Rodent, which is this kind of unsanitized version of Mickey Mouse. And he also made these war comics, Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales, that were very, very thoroughly researched. Like he would send his assistants onto submarines for 3 weeks to take notes and bring it back, and he would write a scenario around it. And they were often about like young kids who were caught in war. And in the war comics, like Sergeant Rock and the Easy Company, you have this guy who's like 40 years old, and he likes this stuff. He eats gooks for breakfast, you know, but the soldiers in frontline combat were terrified, which seems like a much more appropriate response to being in a trench. And they died. And the stories had a kind of strange, because it was at a time during the Korean War that they were kind of pacifist war comics. And they were very rigorously and well told. And, well, when I discovered them, they were important for me.
And how were they received in the United States? Did they have a larger audience?
Yeah, among terrified GIs, they were very popular.
And at about that time, you started to make comics yourself?
I started making comics, I guess, the first ones I can find now are from when I was about 10 or 11 years old. But I think I was drawing cartoons before, but actually making a little strip began when I was about 11 or 12. And then by the time I was 14, I was already making my own amateur magazines. And beginning to meet some of the cartoonists who were part of later the underground comics scene, like Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson. See, what happened was I discovered through my interest in Mad Comics, there was a network of fans at that time, not as developed as it exists in the world now, but who liked to make magazines that were kind of writing about the magazines that they liked and imitating the magazines that they liked. So there's one magazine called Wild that was printed in purple ink by a guy in Baltimore who was 15 years old and working part-time as a grocery clerk and publishing his magazine. And I was one of the younger contributors at 13. And, well, I wanted to start my own, so I did one called Blasé. But I couldn't afford this high-class purple ink printing that he used for Wild magazine. Mine was printed on something that was called a hectograph, which was a piece of gelatin, really, literally. It was a pan with gelatin in it. And you could take a piece of carbon paper and put it down. This was in a world before photocopying machines. You could put this carbon paper down on the gelatin, and then you could apply paper to the gelatin and transfer a weak purple copy off it. And you knew that your run was finished when there were little chunks of gelatin stuck to the piece of paper after about 40 copies. And so I did a couple of issues of that. And from that I started actually to work professionally at about the age of 15.
Yeah, that is quite soon. And did you decide to get some art training to work on your drawings?
Well, I was resistant to art training. My parents were very unhappy about... Well, my mother wasn't so unhappy that I was drawing. She thought it was okay. My father thought this was definitely not as useful as a way to spend my time as others. So they let me go to a kind of trade high school. It was called the High School of Art and Design. Some people know the High School of Music and Art because there's a film called Fame. And this was kind of like a blue-collar version of that school. You learned to do paste-up and mechanicals. But they had a couple of cartooning courses also. And my parents let me go there as long as I agreed to go to college after. And my father would kind of take me aside and explain to me that I should really study to be a doctor, and this wasn't a good place to do it. And I had no interest in that whatsoever. And then when he finally came to terms with the fact that I didn't want to be a doctor, he settled for the fact that I would be a dentist. Because in Auschwitz, dentists were doctors too, of course. And his argument was good, which was, if I became a dentist, I could continue to draw at night. But if I became a cartoonist, nobody would let me drill their teeth at night. He let me go to the school with the understanding that I'd go to college afterwards, but wasn't that excited and enthusiastic about it. And they thought that they would dissuade me from becoming a cartoonist by giving me lessons in painting. So I had to go and take this kind of painting bowls of fruit and things like that. And I got along very badly. Mostly it was like middle-aged women who were very happy with the fruit and the flowers, and I was supposed to be doing it also, and I would always just make my cartoons on the palette instead. So it didn't take very well, the real formal art training.
So it's your own initiative to go your own way as a comics artist and to start your own magazines. You already started when you were 15, and you continued doing your own magazines. And working also in magazines of other people. You mentioned Jay Lynch, who was quite famous. He had a magazine of his own too. He was an editor. And I think about such sort of magazines, I noticed your first work as sort of a flying cat or something in space. I don't remember exactly, but it is a very long time ago. And at a certain moment you started with a magazine together with Bill Griffith, Arcade Mag. And it was a sort of a time when the underground magazines, there was a sort of a too much published, and looking for enlarging the market. There were, I think, comics book, one of them, and the other one arcade, to get a larger distribution.
Kind of. I went out to California at a certain point because it was the mecca for underground cartoonists, and very quickly, underground comics had become sort of a fad in America, and Zap Comics was very well known, and people would go in and ask for Zap, and if they couldn't get Zap, they would take one of the others, and for a while that allowed for lots of comics to be published, and soon too many. So Bill Griffith, who had just moved out to California at around the same time I had, and I figured, well, let's make one magazine for the cartoonists. We'll make it like a lifeboat. And we thought if we made a quarterly magazine, we could get onto newsstands and find a different means of distribution outside this overfed underground comics head shop market. And we never quite found it. Around the same time, as you said, there was something called Comics Book from Marvel, where they found the distribution but had a harder time finding the artists. We had a great time finding the artists and no luck finding the distributors.
And one thing always in this sort of comic books is that you don't see a certain style of that each artist works in, but each artist has his own style and is presented because of his personality.
Yeah, it wasn't about characters or anything. It wasn't about whatever, like here's Peanuts or here's something else. Each time out, one would do something different.
Yeah, that's very good. And then afterwards started, of course, Roll Magazine.
Yes, this was a later period again.
Later period again, yeah.
Somewhere in the middle of doing arcade, in spite of the fact that there was no demand for arcade, we decided we would come out quarterly, by God. And with this particular group of people, it was ridiculous to have such a tight, hard deadline, because nobody was used to even getting up on any given day. And so we came out every 3 months, which was really harrowing. And after about, I think, 3 issues, I couldn't stand it anymore. I moved to New York because everybody was angry at me. I was the editor as well as a fellow artist. So I moved to New York to become the bad cop while Bill Griffith could be the good cop in San Francisco and explain that I wasn't letting any of this work get published. And so I was editing from New York, and it lasted about 7 or 8 issues, and then by popular demand we stopped. Because the only distribution we had was into these head shops who were used to getting 1 comic a year, and we had already used up all of the rack space for arcade in 1 year. And then nothing was happening for a while, and really so little was happening that cartoonists were beginning to walk around with great work that had no place to be published, because what was left of the underground comics by 1980 were really only publishing either the very well-known underground cartoonists or people who could more or less mimic the very well-known underground cartoonists. So there wasn't room for what the underground had originally established itself for, which was to allow people to express their personality through comics. Well, while I was in New York, I met various people in the magazine world, and including a distributor who said, "Oh yes, we had our eye on arcade. We were waiting to see if it would reach 8 issues." And we stopped after 7, so... but it indicated to me that maybe there was a way to distribute things. And also, at that time, I met somebody who was involved in starting magazines, and he wanted to start a comics magazine. And he had this big budget planned and where he was going to get the money, and we were going to work together. And then he explained that for the first cover he had this great idea, and it would be this woman and her breasts would be very big and there'd be these little characters on them. Then I realized maybe this wasn't the magazine I had in mind. And so, and around the same time, lots of magazines would come around and ask me to be a consultant for, they wanted to have comics in their magazine. And then I'd give my ideas and they'd say, well, no, it's Playboy, we'd like it to be about sex, or it's High Times, we'd like it to be about drugs. And so Françoise Mouly, my wife, and I just decided to make one prototype of what the magazine should be. So anybody who was asking what comics should look like, we would show them. And we chose a very large format, and we chose a way of making it so it would look like it was part of this new wave of magazines that was beginning to happen. Like there was a magazine called Wet, the magazine for gourmet bathers. And it wasn't much about anything, but it was very graphically exciting. And at the same time, there was a magazine called Skyscraper, which was the magazine for gourmet architects or something. And we figured we'd make the Gourmet Comics magazine. And since it was large size, it would have a place on the newsstand. And well, we did one, and then the artists were very happy with it. We were happy with it. It sold out its small print run quite quickly, and we kept doing it more or less for 10 years.
So this gourmet magazine had the subtitle, the magazine for
The first one was Postponed Suicides.
Yeah.
From a quote by E.M. Cioran, which was, every book is a postponed suicide.
And this is
Well, it had a different subtitle for almost every issue. This one is the Graphics Magazine for Damned Intellectuals.
Yes, and one was the graphics magazine that lost its faith in nihilism. And on our stationery it just said Raw, the graphics magazine that changes its subtitle every issue.
And it's about the same thing for the first issue of Raw, where you didn't write sort of a motto to explain people how the magazine is. You printed what many magazines said about their first issue.
Oh yes, the first issue's editorial column was just quotes from other magazines' first issu's editorial column. So we had many that only lasted one issue, and some from Mencken and Hefner and whatever.
At what time started the interest that you had also in, let's say, art like people like Frans Mazereel or Georg Gross?
Well, there was a period where I was kind of a slob snob. I was very suspicious of high culture. Unless it had balloons, I wouldn't look at it. And on the other hand, Kafka was exempt, because I thought of these as scenarios for the EC comics, or maybe Twilight Zone episodes that had gotten lost. So I read Kafka quite happily, but and literature was easier, but painting especially seemed like it was definitely off on the side for a different class than mine. And it took quite a lot to get me to look seriously at these things. Finally, a friend of mine who didn't have these prejudices, who's been quite important in my life since, a guy named Ken Jacobs, who's a filmmaker and a professor of cinema in Binghamton, dragged me into a museum, stood me in front of a Picasso and said, look, just think of it as a large comic book panel.
That was the right approach.
And it worked, You know, there's Fra Angelico and Fra Zeta, you know, it was... So somehow I began to look at these things, and certainly the German expressionists were the easiest to like, because they looked the most like big comic book panels.
And you had an idea with them that they expressed really what was happening at the time, or their feelings, or their emotions in their work?
Well, after I managed to penetrate, I still had an easier time looking at things that were pictures of something than things that were pure paint on canvas, like the abstract expressionists and Joseph Albers and things like that. Took a longer time.
So a story in it.
Some kind of, at least if you could recognize that it's a picture of a woman and a kitty cat, then you could look nice colors, nice forms. But it was just the beginning of being able to just accept this as part of the mix and not be so prejudiced against it.
And the comics that are presented in your first book, Breakdowns, we already see a lot of experimentation in several comics. It looks like you try every time really something else. There are comics, all pictures the same with different texts. There are maybe the same text but all pictures different. I mean, there is so enlargement in seeing what your interest is. And
yes, I would say around this time, around 1970, 71, these prejudices broke down for me against what I prior to that had considered this snob culture. And then I got enlisted into snob culture and began to read and look at things and wanted to see a way to make comics that could include some of the ideas and concerns and currents that had been present in all of the other arts but had more or less passed comics by. And so it just seemed to me that Gertrude Stein or James Joyce could have been a scenarist for comics. Picasso or George Gross could have drawn them, and if they weren't going to do it, by God, maybe I could. And so I was more interested in kind of researching possibilities rather than in finding any given way
Yeah.
to make it. And so each one was a different thesis.
Yeah.
And it's still true for me that each project is a kind of having to get reborn and reinvent myself as an artist to make it.
And it makes it possible also when later you need to choose a certain technique or how to express a certain story, that you can choose with your experience already done in the stories in breakdowns.
I guess so.
Yeah. So, when was the first story of Mouse? That's also in breakdowns.
Yeah, the very first one was about 1971.
Yeah.
I'd already been involved with the underground newspapers and underground comics, and somebody was, at that time, the editing of underground comics prior to the one I was editing that we talked about before, Arcade, was very casual. It was just somebody had an idea for a book,
Yeah.
and they would tell other people what kind of work they were looking for, and if you had something, you would send it along.
Yeah.
And somebody was doing a comic called Funny Aminals, and the only requirement was if you were interested in making something with anthropomorphic characters, send it along.
Yeah.
And so the idea for using cats and mice was given to me in a way before the subject matter.
Yeah.
And for a while I was trying to do it because it seemed like it would be a nice group of people in this comic. It was Robert Crumb, Bill Griffith, Justin
Yeah.
Green. And so I was trying to find a subject, and my first thought was actually to do a horror comic with cats and mice.
Yeah.
And in a way I did, I suppose.
I think Louis wants to ask you something.
Isn't there, I thought there has been in one of your earlier mouses a story about a father and a little son who speaks about cats and
Yes, that's
cats
this
and
three-page
mice.
story, yeah.
So the idea of putting the story in the form of a animal fable, allegory, can be even earlier than that particular...
Well, this story that you're talking about is the one I'm talking about now, which is the one from 1971.
Yeah.
And it was kind of father telling his very little boy a bedtime story about life in the old country.
But is that historical? Did your father, in fact,
Tell me bedtime stories when I was a baby?
about mouses and cats?
No. What was historical was that I sort of grew up hearing these stories and getting them fed to me with my mother's milk in a way, let's say. So this was, the first three-page mouse was more abstracted, let's say, than, was more abstracted than what became the mouse books that people now know. For one thing, I had transposed it into being a little boy hearing a bedtime story.
Yeah.
And second of all, I didn't refer to Jews and to Germans at all. It was de Moise and de Katzen. So for a three-page story, this allegorical level could hold more cohesively than for a longer work. At that point, I had to decide whether I was doing allegory or history, I suppose. And here it was less of an issue. So the shoe factory that appears as something I talk about in the Mao's book, here was presented as a kitty litter factory. But many of the other details are accurate, so it's the same anecdotes for some, well, a few of the anecdotes. And the drawing, of course, also was quite different. In the context of the underground comics that surrounded this, the drawing here was actually relatively sober, because the regular underground comics, using Crumb, let's say, as a very well-known example, had a real exuberance to them. And compared to that, this had a kind of quietness, but not nearly as muted as what I discovered would work better for the long book. So here, there are these big cats and little mice, much too melodramatic to my taste now, but at the time, it was a way into this material.
So you adapt your technique, your style to the content matter.
Yeah, I always assumed that somehow whatever style is, it should be, on one hand, the least important element, because I think it was Picasso who once said that your style is the difference between the way you draw a circle and a perfect circle. And so you don't have to worry about style because your ineptitude will give you a style. But if you talk about surface, then style has a lot to do with business, with capitalism and commerce, because then you're talking about trademarks almost rather than anything else. Like if you can have a specific flourish, then people know that if they want that patina, they come to you. And for me, that surface I try to find from the material itself and see what would be most appropriate as a way to reflect what's inside.
So what did you use for mouse?
For the longer work.
The
for
longer
for
work,
book.
yeah.
Well, at first I didn't know. I was more interested in getting... The first decision was I wanted to make a long story. Then I began to kind of gather data, like read and interview my father. And while I was interviewing my father, I would make these kind of breakdown sketches just to see what kind of information might fit on one page, how much information in any given box, what should the rhythmic flow of the information be. And without any real self-consciousness, I was just doodling in the cats and the mice, right? Then, at some point, I began to make this conscious effort to discover how should I draw this thing. And at that point, I tried in sketchbooks drawing different kinds of cats and mice, some looking more like real cats and mice, some looking more like the animated cartoon animals, some looking whatever, different ways of doing it, hair, no hair, clothes, no clothes, I don't know, I tried different things. And after a number of wrong turns, including, like in this exhibit here in the Jüdische Historische Museum, there's an example of one drawn in scraper board that looks a little bit, to my mind, what I was thinking of was kind of an Eastern European children's book, maybe, to make that kind of drawing. But it had some of the same problems as this. It was very melodramatic with this big cat that looked like Marlon Brando in The Young Lions, you know, and it also had this problem of being each box was too drawn. And the result was you wouldn't go from box to box without thinking. You would stop and look at the pictures. And that kind of stopping maybe was nice in terms of showing off, that I could maybe draw a little bit, but wasn't so good for actually getting out of the way of the story itself. Eventually, it occurred to me that these drawings I was making unself-consciously to try to indicate where things would be were the clue as to how it should finally look. It should be unmitigated as possible and look like it had a kind of immediacy. The problem with it was, first of all, sometimes these drawings were so hazy that you couldn't see what it was a picture of, and sometimes they were too interesting gesturally because they were just scribbled in. So I wanted to find something that was based on this, as if you could take this original sketch and somehow turn the lens enough to bring it into focus. So it would be like a focused version of handwriting. So it fell somewhere between handwriting and map making. And I also decided to make these drawings the same size that they would be printed, because then there would be very little room for embellishment, but only the most essential things could come through. And also that way there would be a kind of maybe one-to-one intimacy between the ratio of the picture and the printed copy, and therefore between me and the reader. That it would have, in that sense, my handwriting printed actual size, and it would be more like a diary.
Like a diary.
Yeah.
This was the original format.
Well, yes, except we couldn't afford to print it exactly the same size the first issue, so the first one is reduced, and then after that, as we got more money, we printed it as it should be. This is actually too small, but
Yeah.
well. Then the other thing I decided very early on was to to get all of my art supplies in the stationer's shop rather than in the art supply shop, so I could be more like a writer.
And you used the fountain pen.
So I used a fountain pen to draw with, and typewriter correction fluid to correct, and that was more like method acting maybe, that if I didn't go into an art supply shop I wouldn't,
And you had an interesting question about expressions, because it connects with...
Yes, because there has been in Holland famous book about facial expression, how we can interpret, whether we can interpret somebody else's facial expression to see what he really feels or thinks. The book is from Nico Freida, and it has appeared in 1956. But it then was a question whether we can see what another person feels. So it is obvious they had never consulted a cartoonist, because the fact there being cartoons proves that you can sustain a story by giving expressions. But I showed, I didn't have to show, but I discussed a mouse with Freida, and he was amazed by the subtlety with which you can manage very expressive things on a mouse mask. For instance, the eyes, they are just spots with a small arc as an eyebrow. Or
It was hard with the mice because they had no mouths. So
they had no mouth. In his view, the mouth is a contact organ of the face. We needed to interpret somebody else's
that
expression.
brings up a few interesting things. One, as well as the face, there's the context. So there's a famous film, maybe is it Eisenstein or
Potemkin. The effect.
The one where it was kind of a film experiment. They filmed a woman with a blank expression on her face, and then they intercut different events, like a baby being fed, and then the blank face, a war, and the blank face, and the woman was given credit for being a great actress because she responded so well to everything. So the context is at least as important as the face itself, certainly in Mouse. And it brought several things to mind that aren't quite connected, but that's one. Another one is that in the very beginning of comics goes to maybe a guy named Rudolf Topfer, who's a Swiss gymnasium teacher who kind of invented comics as a hobby. He wanted to be a painter, but he couldn't draw very well, so like all of us since, we became cartoonists. And he made these little picture stories, and as part of it, not only was he the grandfather of comics, but he also became the grandfather of semiotics. He wrote an essay called, an essay on physiognomy, which at that time was considered quite a science, of telling character from facial form. And as part of this, he discovered that with a few simple lines, you could indicate something that was bunk as science, but was quite useful as sign language. So that a person with a big forehead and a small chin would be seen intelligent, but a big chin and a small forehead would be seen as stupid. And this became the basic vocabulary for all comic artists ever since. And he also discovered that certain signs were fixed and certain signs were mutable. So certain marks would indicate the physiognomic form, and other ones, like the eyebrows that you were talking about going up or down, would indicate could change, and you'd still recognize the face, but they would give you different expressions. So he formalized this very, very early in the history of comics. Then the third thing I would point out from the few words that you gave was one of my models for Mouse in the final form was an American comic strip called Little Orphan Annie. Because Little Orphan Annie had these blank eyes. And it always seemed to me like a very expressive strip because it had a kind of stillness to it, and because you would project into the blank piece of paper left for the eyeball what Little Orphan Annie was feeling. And in a way, these mouse faces are almost blank. And there's very little that allows you to locate the expression. But as a result, since in Marshall McLuhan terms, it's a very cool medium, you can kind of you bring a lot to it, and therefore create a lot of emotion and expression.
I hear this, but I'm asking myself whether you aren't being too modest, because of course the context is all important to know whether somebody has an expression of any feeling at all. That's the conclusion of Freida. If you knew the overall context, then you could very finally judge what went on. I remember, for instance, that some of your figures, they show the emotion by their bodily expression as much as more than by their...
But they are Jewish, they use their
hands. Exactly. The hands are as important as the face for talking.
If we take, for instance, the moment that your protagonist is pressing his father, where are the little cahiers my mother wrote? And then he says, can't you blow your tobacco somewhere else? It would be better if you would. So he makes an avoidant movement, but all the same, if you look at the face, or I may be victim of suggestion, but I think that the face looks desperate. He is desperately trying to gain
Control of the situation.
control of the situation.
Yes, I mean, so part of it is context, and part of it is, you know, when you make comics, it's all cartoonists. In order to do it, you have to kind of be an actor. You enter into the individual figure while you are drawing it. So it's not uncommon if you're sitting with somebody who's drawing. They're grimacing, you know, because they're trying to draw something angry.
Yeah.
Or they're looking stupid while they're drawing like Beavis and Butthead, or I don't know, like that. It's just part of entering in. And you try as much as you can to infuse it without even consciously thinking of what marks you are making.
Every artist starts with a little mirror.
Yeah.
You draw the expressions much with the same spontaneity as just have them.
Yeah, because after a while you learn the basic vocabulary, and it's a finite vocabulary. It's part of what's interesting to me in comics is it's such a finite vocabulary. You have eyebrows down and eyebrows up and eyebrows straight across, but very little else. Sometimes no eyebrows.
Still, you have also the eyes that are not dots, but are little arcs, for instance.
Yes. Yeah, you have. Yeah, it's about a 20-word vocabulary. It's like a kind of Esperanto.
But there is also the advance of doing a comic, which means you make a series of pictures, so that the change of the face, you need very little things, and then you have the change.
An arc of movement.
Yeah, and that helps a lot, and that's an advance from comics above to other media.
And since it's so stripped down, like I was trying to say before, it actually leaves a lot of room to enter in, and that's very useful to actually make something feel really emotive.
It does. Because in the beginning, when you were discussing, I had a feeling of being, if the Greek had been right and it would have been pornography, I felt like the poor Schlemiel who was excited instead of interested in the techniques of. And I think the Mouse is a very exciting book. The emotion that evokes is very strong in me, at any rate.
Is the emotion as strong with men as with women? That's something that always bothers me. So very little women read comics.
But you know, I was thinking recently about the comics that had an impact on me, because people keep asking what are your influences. And I refer to the comics that I think of the most, but I realized that at a certain point, something I noticed was when you're about 8, you always read Donald Duck, whether you're a boy or a girl. But at a certain point, you split, and the boys start reading superheroes, or here maybe they read, I don't know, 1010 or Buck Danny, or I don't know what. And if you're a girl, you read other comics. And the comics in America that you would read at that time were romance comics very often, which were kind of little love stories of, the girl likes this one guy who doesn't like her, but this other guy likes her, and then she does something stupid and she feels really ashamed, and then finally the guy who she really likes notices her, and it has a nice ending. But somewhere in there, it's telling a very stripped down version of an emotional story, the soap opera kind of story. And as a result, I saw little girls reading comics and crying. And it was very interesting to me that a comic could elicit tears as well as laughs. Even though the comics that I was relegated to, the superhero comics, weren't trying to accomplish that, the fact that it could be accomplished in comics was probably an important thing to notice.
And you made good uses of it.
Yes, a little love story that took place in the 40s.
There is a love story in Mouse.
Yes.
Yeah.
But is your impression that comics for grown-ups are mainly for men, or is it?
Maybe it's for sissies, I don't know.
It's for sissies. Could be. Damned intellectuals.
No, I know a lot of girls reading Mouse. I mean, for your audience, probably it.
I suppose there is a kind of little boys club of cartoonists that I know in America that definitely are drawing as if they were still 12 years old, you know. It's the kind of comics they want to make and the audience that they're trying to find. But basically comics are just a value-neutral medium, you know, so they can carry the content that one brings to it. And often it does get used. There is its history is such that it has tended to become more of a boy's medium than a girl's medium. But it's changing anyway. At this point there are many more women cartoonists certainly than when I was growing up. And there's a much wider range of what's possible as subject matter for comics, and probably the subject matter determines what audience might be found.
And is there a difference in the American comic culture, the European one, and did the European comic culture influence you?
Yeah, there's an interesting feedback system, I think, between America and Europe. I mean, as we were saying, Rudolf Topfer, Swiss, eventually influences, let's say, importantly, Wilhelm Busch in Germany, and then little Willie Hearst is kind of playing tricks on his nanny while he's living in Germany, discovers Max and Moritz and brings it back to America in his head, and when he has a newspaper, he says, let's imitate Max and Moritz, and he begins the Katzenjammer Kids, which is the beginning of comics history as we know it. And that feedback system certainly continues even to this day, so that the underground comics, which happened in America, became like a floating crap game. Like, very soon the game moved to Holland. From Holland, maybe it moved to France, and in each country, artists brought a kind of dialect or sensibility that changed what was happening. And for a long time in the recent past, European comics, French comics specifically maybe, affected the way comics started to look and be, and that now has come back and started to influence American comics.
I think we will have our short intermission now. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, no longer, because we want to put a lot of questions into the second half. You can put your questions down on paper at the bookstall, and Art will run, trying not to break his leg there, and maybe sign a few copies.
Where should I go?
Well, back there, Joost will.
I will take
Yeah.
Oké, microfoon aan. Ben ik verstaanbaar? Was iedereen ook voor de pauze goed verstaanbaar? Dat is heel vreselijk. Wat kunnen we daaraan doen? Dichter bij de microfoon gaan zitten. En in de microfoon praten. Harder praten. Nou, het lukt mij best wel. We hebben nog maar heel weinig tijd. Dat is erg jammer. We hebben nog het gigantische... de impact van Maus is eigenlijk waar we het over gaan hebben. Oh, sorry, I should do it in English. We're going to talk about mother's language. Okay.
This is not the Peter Stuyvesant Institute, it's the John Adams Institute.
Is it? Okay, we have very little time. We have a mass of questions that fall roughly into three categories. The first one is, what are you going to do next, and can you do this or that? The second category is, what do you think about Schindler's List?
Category.
That's a category, yeah. Well, lots of questions relating to the reception, and the first, and I want to start with what for lots of people seems to be a very deeply felt problem is how you deal with your father. How did you get him to do it? It's how did you get your father to do it? Lots of people have difficulty, it seems, to get their parents to start talking about this.
Well, I know that, you know, as a result of doing Maus, I've met many people who've had situations analogous, let's say, to mine. My father never was, he never had a need to bear witness, and he never talked about it very freely, and yet he didn't have the same inhibitions that I know other families where the parents who had gone through the camps had an impossible time of talking about it. My father's situation was different. He after the war did talk about it a bit among family and friends and whatever that he met as he left Poland. And he found that people were kind of scared to hear it and disinterested in it. And as a result, he sort of closed it off, saying, well, nobody wants to hear such stories. That was then, this is now. We have to start life again. And so he just shut it off, but without having it as without having as severe an injunction against talking about it, let's say, as some other people had. Because the responses were as varied as the experiences within the general maelstrom. And my mother, on the other hand, spoke about it quite often, usually out of context in a way that absolutely terrified me, because it didn't have a context. It was maybe one of the reasons I had to make this 13-year-long context. It would be more in the way of we're walking as I am a kid, I'm walking with her. She begins to walk very quickly, saying, we have to go home, not to the supermarket, because I have to go to the bathroom. I remember when I was back in Auschwitz and I had to go to the bathroom, they would beat you if you went to the bathroom, and except at a certain time. So one time I had to go and my friends in the field stood around me, and so nobody would see me, and I was able to piss. And then she was going to piss, and I vowed I would never piss again, So it was one way of talking. But I didn't have the situation that some people have of having parents that refuse categorically to talk about it. So I can't give advice firsthand on how that should be done. With Vladek, when I began to ask him directly, he answered me directly. Before that, he didn't say. So it's a little bit like, well, okay, it's your legacy. You want to know, I'll tell you. But that's different than having to unlock a door. Once we began to talk, he talked quite openly, I think. I can't know what he didn't tell me, of course. And on the other hand, he also talked in certain tracks. I think you'll find this with almost anybody. When you ask them their story, including me, the things that have been said before are the easiest to find, because you've already made a groove through your brain for that narrative. So it was very hard to get more information out of Vladek after that initial round of talking. And for that, I had to press him and push him harder, because those were more repressed stories or didn't formulate as stories per se in his head. And it was harder to get those things out of him. And that's why after we would finish, I would say, okay, let's start again. Partially also because I didn't want it to stop. It was the only way I could have a relationship with Vladek was as an interviewer.
But it was meant as for publication from the start?
Yes.
And he knew that?
Yes, although it was very interesting to me because he seemed to forget it most of the time. Mm-hmm. Even the first round, when I first went back to him while working on this 3-page mouse, what would happen is I made him talk for 2 or 3 days into a microphone. I think I mentioned it earlier, like about 10 hours of tape that became the core story. Yeah. And most of the time he was totally unaware that there was a tape recorder. And I thought, great, he's really not aware. And at the very, very end, he grabbed the microphone for the first time in 3 days and said, and so, ladies and gentlemen, so it was. Never again should such a thing happen in the world. And it was the only time I was aware that he was more aware than I thought.
But then he had already seen publication of Maus.
No, this was the first time.
This was the first
time.
When
I was working on the 3-page strip. You see, part of what made me a cartoonist and part of what made this all happen is that he had no interest or knowledge or understanding of comics. Perhaps if I came and said I am writing a book, or I am doing the story of Auschwitz's tooth fillings, maybe then he would have paid attention. But as it was, comics was beyond the frequency of his hearing. It didn't exist. So for the most part, he seemed rather unaware.
But you make him sound like a majestic storyteller.
He is a great storyteller.
Very gifted man. The details he recalls, they are very telling.
One thing I'm very happy about is that now there is this CD-ROM version of Maus that I think eventually will be part of the exhibit at the Jewish Museum even. And the one thing that it makes available is about maybe 2 hours of Vladek's taped versions of the stories, and it's like getting the other half of a telephone conversation. Like you always heard my half of the conversation by having the book, and then having his version of the story come more directly is valuable, maybe.
Yeah.
What was his first reaction when he saw his story published?
He didn't have one.
He didn't have one.
The sum of his reaction is included in the first book, where it sort of says, yes, someday you'll be famous, like what's his name? But it was very abstract.
Yes.
Was it ever any ever difficult for you to work on this subject as well?
Well, yeah, probably for many reasons throughout.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was one point where I really had to stop, and this is actually reflected also in the book when there's this interjection of the sequence with the journalists and the shrink.
Yeah.
And this was the result of a whatever 6 months to 1 year impasse where I couldn't go forward. Well, why not? Partially because I had already finished volume 1. This book was a book that was separated before birth. It was always meant to be one longer work. It got divided into part 1 and part 2. But when part 1 came out, I wasn't really prepared for it to be successful. It never occurred to me. And I had already begun working on the second book, and of course had an outline of the whole thing for the several years before. But I'd finished chapter 1 of book 2, let's say, when I had to go out on this book tour for Mouse 1, and all of a sudden I realized that it was much more public than I thought. And that confused the hell out of me, actually, and also gave me pause, it finally concretized itself as this image in the second chapter of book 2, which was me sitting on top of a pile of corpses being successful. So this created a big inhibition. To what degree am I violating a trust? Those concerns, incidentally, in some way are part of my response to Schindler's List. Okay, I can come back again to it, but it relates to this feeling about certain responsibility that comes with that territory. Also, all along I knew that Auschwitz was going to give me trouble, as it gives everybody trouble. And I didn't know how to draw it, in a way, because, as I said before, you have to inhabit each moment of what you are drawing. And as hard as it was to draw the pieces before the camps, there's a reason why this is called the concentration camp universe. Even in the ghettos, there was the vestiges of family life still present. So one could project oneself perhaps more easily into that moment-to-moment life than into what happened when the laws of the universe were so totally, even the opposite in some ways, of what one associates with normal daily life. And the idea of what it meant to have life in a death camp seemed so oxymoronic, and yet I had to be drawn moment by moment, because there was some kind of life in the death camps, that it was hard to understand even how to visualize it. And so that stopped me from knowing how to draw. At first I thought maybe I would have to draw everything a little more abstractly because it was hazier for me. And oddly enough, I found in looking back now that if anything, these chapters on the camps are drawn more precisely than the other sections, with a little bit more detail. And it was a way maybe of compensating for the problems of seeing. That there was 1 degree less abstraction.
There's a question here. Do you think that telling about the Holocaust in the way you do, very detailed, visual and direct, is only possible or less difficult for people who aren't victims or survivors and can therefore take some distance? So, second generation and...
No, because among the important works for me is a guy named Alfred Cantor, who was a guy who survived the camps as a very young man. And while he was in the camps and immediately after, he kept a little... In the camps, he made tiny drawings for himself of what he was seeing to report on it. Most of these he destroyed because it was dangerous even to have them. When he was in DP camp after, he made the drawings again. Those drawings are not very beautiful or skillful as drawings, but they're very moving and very telling in the amount of information. And in the 60s, I think, this was published, at least in America, as the Book of Alfred Cantor. He had gone on to become a very successful commercial art director or something. And that book and many other survivors' drawings were important visual data for me because there were not little kind of Polaroid cameras in the camps, so this kind of visual information was for the most part unavailable to anybody who didn't really live through it. And so I found those drawings very important in understanding nuances of what was where. And I don't claim, of course, that to be outside it and to make commentary or drawing or representation of it is at all the same as having lived through it. There are so many differences that it would take hours to talk about that, but I don't think it's impossible for somebody inside the camp to take the distance, and probably the ultimate proof would be a book of short stories by a guy named Tadeusz Borowski called This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, which at the same time are the most chilling and vivid of stories about daily life in the death camp, done by a Polish socialist poet, not Jewish, and who was in fact a capo in the camps, made while he was in DP camp for 5 or 7 years after the war, before he moved to East Germany, became a good Communist Party member and stuck his head in an oven and died that way. But well, that's more biography than you need. But these stories are among the most distanced and direct at the same time. And for me, they provided a very important point of entry into how to understand how to depict.
You had a question about shame and guilt feelings. Maybe that it's appropriate to pose it now.
Yes, to my mind, what you and your father have achieved is something very exceptional, because I daily see the opposite, a complete impossibility of communicating about experiences in question, and a big abyss filled with shame. And shame is another subject I'm interested in, but it looks as if Vladek wouldn't be very fruitful in shame, because he is completely shameless. Perhaps only in the perspective of his son. That might be.
Well, you know, I don't know if it takes too long to tell, but it's one thing that was very interesting to me was these conversations I had with this therapist named Paul Pavel, who was also a survivor of the camps, and became a very interesting process, a necessary process for me to continue working on the books, because my father had died actually in '82, so he'd seen the first 4 chapters. I was continuing, and I needed to have more conversations, but there was nobody to talk to. And in classical Freudian terms, it was very easy to make the transference to another person who had gone through the camps and continue asking questions, but now to somebody who had a much more reflective notion of what he had gone through than my father had. And so, for example, Vladek tells a story about how he got cigarettes and he used them to exchange and barter. And I was confused because I'd never read in my supplementary reading anything about people getting cigarettes in the camps per se. So I asked Pavel about it, and as I often did, I mean, this was a thoroughly tax-deductible therapy. I would ask him about things I needed for the book directly, and I'd say, well, he tells me this, I can't find anything about it. Did you ever get cigarettes in the camps? And he said, well, no, but your father was in Auschwitz I, I was in Birkenau. Maybe as a worker they did, I don't know. And then he said, oh, well, wait, yes. Later I was in Gleiwitz, and I remember at Christmas we got a pack of cigarettes. And then he said, but it was very interesting to me because I didn't smoke. So I lit one up, tried it, didn't like it especially, but I was surrounded by other boys who needed cigarettes, and they wanted to trade bread for these cigarettes. And I found this dilemma, because if I took their bread and gave them something they didn't need, I could be seen as killing them in a certain way. So eventually, I suppose, I remember what I did was I just distributed them as best I could, and that was that. Now that's a very different response. I don't claim it to be necessarily better, or like that I condemn Vladek for not doing this, but I just use it as an example to point out that there are different degrees of understanding one's own experiences, different degrees maybe even of survival. And in that way, these issues like shame, shamelessness, there's an entire spectrum of response.
But still, that's an important emotion potentially in people who have been badly treated.
Absolutely.
So what does he do with it? Well, he probably passes it on to his...
well, sure, there's a legacy that comes with it.
And he makes you cringe, or he makes your protagonist cringe when he does certain
Yes,
things.
I think it's represented visually in this same sequence where art gets smaller and smaller.
And his mask doesn't fit very well anymore. Like,
Yeah, well, this sequence actually, I used these different masks in this
Yeah.
sequence. Pavel wears a Vladek mask, and it's like a little old mouse with
didn't
glasses
notice.
again.
I didn't notice.
And you see that there are kind of human heads behind it because it represented a different layer of present tense. Before there was a kind of present tense between Vladek and Art and the past tense of the story Vladek was telling. And here I needed a kind of different present tense that was further in the future than the other present tense. So this was a visual way of creating a grammar for those tenses.
I'll look again and see the Vladek mask on Pavel.
Yeah. Well, we can't avoid Schindler's List, apparently. You already mentioned it. There's lots of questions about what's your opinion, and...
I preferred E.T.
So did I. Are there any countries where mouse is forbidden, like Schindler's List?
Not forbidden, but the Poles have sort of indicated to me very clearly that they weren't interested in publishing it. Well, Schindler's List, okay. You know, the thing is, I've been trying to avoid getting embroiled in this Schindler's List problem but I did get thoroughly enlisted by a friend at the Village Voice, so I went public in this roundtable discussion that they published. So now, okay. But the reason I was reluctant is I was watching Claude Lanzmann squirm in Europe over this film, and I saw his responses being taken rather badly, like as if he was trying to kind of copyright his Holocaust as opposed to allowing it as, you know, share and share alike, let everybody have their Holocaust. I was afraid of being perceived as kind of, yeah, well, gee, this guy's got a bigger Holocaust than mine, hey. And also because I had my own Spielberg problem prior to this, which is, before I mentioned that the book had been separated before birth, I didn't intend to publish part one separately from part two. I did it as one longer work in my mind, but with two parts, before the camps and after, and during. And as I was finishing part one, I heard that there was a movie coming out that Spielberg was producing called An American Tale, and it seemed clear to me that it was influenced in some bizarre way by the mouse chapters that were already appearing and this original three-page mouse that had appeared, that instead of Jewish mice and German cats, we now had Russian Mauskowitz mice and Russian Katzaks. And I didn't know what the film would be, but I was rather anxious about it, and I felt it was important to get my book out before this movie came out so that Spielberg could be seen as a derivative version of Spiegelman rather than Spiegelman be seen as a twisted version of Spielberg. And so I tried to get the book to happen that way. And as a result, I already had an animus toward him that made it hard to even look at Schindler's List neutrally, even if that would have been possible. But I'm now convinced that I would have hated it just as much even if Martin Scorsese had directed it as was originally planned. And my problem with it, basically, I suppose, is that if it was purporting to be no more than E.T. and was taken as such, okay, it's one more thing that's there. But Spielberg himself has made quite large claims for it as, quote, in an interview, a document made 50 years after the fact, which is to me a horrifying counterfeit notion that you could make a document 50 years after the fact is bizarre. And as a result, it has implications that ripple past its actual anecdotes. It's not a defense, in my mind, to hear him say, well, but it's based on something that actually happened, because in the Holocaust, for want of a better word, so many things happened that anything could have happened. And once you take it and make it into a narrative, it begins to carry with it a charge, so that everything iconically represents more than itself, so that Schindler represents something. He's not just Mr. Schindler. If he wanted to make a movie about Mr. Schindler, he would have been better off maybe starting in 1946 and making a movie of a lonely man living in Frankfurt in one-room hotel apartment in 1960, getting drunk all the time, with people beating him up as a Jew lover who wasn't very successful in business, whose wife had left him, who was dependent on the charity of the people that he had helped. Well, that would have been a very different movie than to make this kind of heroic anomaly out of German righteous Gentile, where as a result he represents some kind of heroic possibility, and thereby is a strange lens through which to view the destruction of the Jews. It's not to take anything away from his courage or heroism to say that about him. It is to say something about Spielberg's choices, to say that he chose that as his lens. It made more sense for, what's the name of the guy who wrote the book? Keneally? Keneally, who was a Catholic trying to find his way into what had happened, and found the idea of a righteous Christian response important in his own coming to grips with the issues. But then Spielberg was basing his thing not even on the actual Schindler, but on the mitigated Schindler through what was already problematic fiction-fact cocktail. And, well, phew. The specifics, I try to do it, since there's so many questions, I'm trying to make it compact. In the middle of that one? Sure.
Martijn Daalder, comic critic.
The question is, if you just don't look at Schindler's List alone, the generation of survivors is disappearing right now, and the question arises if you have to surpass the historical and go into the symbolical treatment of the Holocaust, and new generations telling their own stories using the Shoah. Well, you made it very clear that Maus is non-fiction, and rightly so. But are there limits to liberty with which you can tell stories about the Shoah for second generation, third generation?
Well, it's a free country. People work as best they can according to their own lights and needs, and then you take what you can use. So, of course, people are free to make any kinds of stories they want. You can't stop them. But
Most says that fiction is an abomination if it concerns the Shoah.
well, this is stronger than what I would say. I would say that just once you enter into this territory, you bring a lot of ghosts with you and a lot of obligations, and you have to tread very carefully. It's a responsibility to not abuse the past. So that this famous quote by Adorno, this famous misquote actually by Adorno, that says no poetry after Auschwitz, is referring really to what it means to take so much real blood and suffering and use it to give some kind of aesthetic pleasure. That there's in some way a diminishment of what actually was done to people to do that. So you have to balance this transgression with the other transgression of forgetting totally about what happened in the past and find some unsatisfactory compromise point through which you can talk. If it takes the form of a fictionalizing work, so be it, if that fiction is somehow a way of telling something true. If, on the other hand, your fiction takes its primary motive, finally, to entertain, which is, I think, true in Schindler's List, let's say, and can be seen clearly, let's say, in this shower scene in the movie, where it's played for Indiana Jones-like suspense. Will it be gas? No, it's water! And Indiana Jones goes on to the next. That this is a specific way of showing and telling that may be appropriate to certain kinds of movie making, but to me is rather offensive as a means of showing how so many people did in fact die.
David Mamet called it emotional pornography.
Well, yeah, it's like I don't want to beat up on Spielberg especially. I've made my peace with it. My book came out first, and but I have real problems with this movie being taken as more than just a movie, being used as a drug to inoculate school children. It's a dangerous drug.
Yeah.
It is, well, your book is without the beautiful music.
Well, I'm asked to finalize it. Just 10 questions in one. What next?
An airplane, and what next? Well, I realize that no matter what I do, I am going to have a 500-pound mouse chasing me. And I have no intention of making mouse 3, 4, 5, 6 Terminator 789. And it was an enclosed work. It took these two parts to make it. These issues, of course, still are in my, they're still in me in some ways, of course, especially as I see a world moving closer to, if we're using these Roman numerals, to Holocaust 2, 3, 4, in a world that's slipped quite rapidly into a situation where Holocausts seem more possible than they did for 50 years, perhaps. On the other hand, I don't want to become the Elie Wiesel of the comic book, and I'm kind of pursuing my own needs and interests, and when they overlap with the issues that were brought up in Mouse, so be it. So I've been doing strips and covers for the New Yorker magazine, and on occasion, one strip, for instance, was about a trip back to Germany to visit Rostock, where the gypsies had been burned out of their housing project. On the other hand, another one was about my interest in Harvey Kurtzman, who we were talking about before. So it's not like I want to stay in one place. I'm finishing up a book now, and probably the whole reason for doing that book was because there's no Jews to speak of, no mice, no socially redeeming value.
So it's not in New York.
It's not the New Yorker?
It's not playing in New York. No Jews, no mice, no...
No, it has sex.
Oh, it has sex.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
What it is it's a book I found in 1971 or so in a used bookshop that I always liked, an old book, and I wanted to make drawings for it because for one thing it would be, I thought, a holiday from having to be a writer. I could just draw, listen to music, watch TV, talk to my friends while I'm drawing, and just illustrate this poem. And it was originally going to be 14 pictures, but because of a certain kind of obsessive-compulsive tendency I have, it turned into 75 pictures. And the result was, after about the first 20, I began to feel, instead of being on holiday, I was in a prison. And every time I would finish a drawing, I could cross it off, like Jean Genet in his cell, marking off another day. So I'm just finishing that now, and it'll come out in November. The Wild Party by Joseph Moncure March.
Is it, can it be answered with one word, your question?
Maybe, I don't know. You said when you were drawing Mouse, you ran into a lot of Jewish ghosts. Or which one were they? Which ones did you take serious? Which did you have to show inside?
Which ghosts?
Yes.
Well, first the immediate family's ghosts. My phantom brother, my grandparents to one degree or another, my mother and father, although there was a kind of time delay in their destructions. I suppose I tried to stay faithful to my understanding of what had happened and to present it as faithfully as possible. I suppose, the taboos that had to be broken for such a book included honor thy father and mother on one level, required a minor transgression in order to do greater honor, perhaps. So that was one. Another one has to do, I suppose, although it has no business in my life, there's a commandment about making human representation. Well, they have masks, so I'm off the hook when I...
Okay, you're off the hook now.
Well... Wow, abrupt. Okay.
Yeah, it's very abrupt because, well, this plane won't wait. No, well, there's no time. There's a taxi cab waiting in 3 minutes outside.
What are the transgressions?
The transgressions. There's lots of questions here that
also,
are not answered.
one thing I learned as a result of doing the book was that this honor thy father and mother business became an issue that I wasn't so aware of. I was just responding rather naturally to my father and presenting it the way I understood my relationship. But after I finished the book and talked to other children of survivors, they were the most shocked about this, because one of the things that comes with this territory is they suffered so much, you shouldn't do anything to make more trouble. And in some ways I think that my expression of anger at Vladek in this book was rather liberating for certain people, because it gave them permission to have the natural feelings that a child has to a parent by expressing dissatisfaction with one's
Not
upbringing.
even to speak of Anya.
Yeah.
No.
So,
Believe me, this causes me as much pain as it does to you. We would love to continue the discussion until all of us had our say and heard as much as we wanted to, but it was part of the condition for having Mr. Spiegelman that he really did have to catch a taxi at 5 o'clock, and so we have to stop. Yeah. Now. Mr. Spiegelman. Our gratitude to you for coming has been compounded infinitely by our gratitude for the way in which you spoke this afternoon. I think that you are the ideal comic strip artist. You are the articulate artist, the artist who does it perfectly with pictures and perfectly with words. And many, many, many thanks. Yeah. Okay, we'll let Mr. Spiegelman go. If you'll allow me to thank the other participants this afternoon and to remain in your seats just for another minute. I know that you have to be in the taxi too, Joost, so I'll give you your bottle. And thank you very, very much. It was a beautiful part of the discussion. So, Mr. Tass, your contribution was very much appreciated. And, of course, the aangever. Gives I want to call your attention to the sign above my head. This afternoon was the last in our series of John Adams' lectures on literature for this season. And we hope to see you back for our future season. We're doing the best we can to get speakers of great distinction. This past year we had E.L. Doctorow, Susan Sontag, Marilyn French, among others, and we're negotiating for you. Yes, you missed those. If you missed them, you missed them. And for the coming season, we're negotiating with Ernest Hillen for his book about the camps in Indonesia in the Second World War, Colin Thubrin, who's written a beautiful book, Among the Russians, David Halberstam, the author of The Best and the Brightest about the 1950s, and the novelists Joan Brady and Peter Matthiessen. Anyone who's interested in keeping in touch with us and getting onto our mailing list, please note our telephone number, which is printed on the posters in the lobby, and give us a call. It's a little crowded and busy this afternoon to take down your names, but in the course of the week, please give us a call with your name and address. We will send you our announcements, and also we'll send you Accept Hero cards in the hope that you can contribute to keeping this lecture series alive. We're not going to rush you away. The bar is open. I know that there's a lot to talk about, and we hope you'll stay a little longer, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.